Twins humiliated by teacher for being black until they call their dad, the school's principal. That's what the title says. And what really happens is even more shocking. During class, two young black girls are singled out, mocked for how they speak, how they look, just for being themselves. The teacher thinks he holds all the power, but he has no idea who their father is, or what's about to happen next. Because when these girls pick up the phone and say just 2 words, everything changes. What secret has their father been keeping? And how far will he go to protect his daughters and expose the truth buried deep inside this school? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Zuri's bedroom floor as she stood before her mirror, adjusting her freshly pressed uniform shirt. Her fingers traced the collar, making sure everything was perfect. Next door, she could hear Amara humming while getting ready, probably dancing around her room like she always did. "Hey sis," Amara's voice carried through their shared wall. "You ready to blow Mr. Darnell away with your essay?" Zuri smiled, gathering her papers from her desk. She'd spent the whole weekend working on this assignment about cultural expressions. Almost done, just checking everything one last time. The twins met in the hallway, their matching uniforms a stark contrast to their different styles. Amara's shirt had a small paint stain near the hem that wouldn't come out, while Zuri's was pristine. Amara's natural hair was styled in an elaborate pattern of twists, decorated with wooden beads that clicked softly when she moved. Zuri wore hers in neat, simple braids. "Let me see what you wrote," Amara said, reaching for Zuri's paper as they walked downstairs together. Zuri pulled it close to her chest. "Not yet. I want it to be a surprise." Her heart fluttered with a mixture of pride and nervousness. She'd taken a risk with this one, weaving in words their grandmother used to say, phrases that carried the weight of their heritage. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast. Their father, Principal Jacobs, stood at the counter in his usual crisp suit preparing breakfast. He turned to greet them with a warm smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Morning, ladies," he said, sliding plates of eggs and toast toward them. "Ready for another week?" "Zuri wrote something amazing for English," Amara announced, pulling out a chair. "She won't let me read it yet, but I can tell." Their father's eyes lit up with interest. "Is this for the cultural expressions assignment?" Zuri nodded, taking small bites of her toast. "I included some of Grandma's sayings, the ones she brought from back home." Principal Jacobs paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. His expression softened with pride. "You know what I always say about your voice? Own it," the twins finished in unison, sharing a knowing look. "That's right," he said, setting down his mug. "Your voice, your heritage, they're not just parts of you, they're your strength. Never let anyone make you feel like you need to dim your light." The morning passed quickly, and soon Zuri found herself in English class, her essay burning a hole in her folder. Mr. Darnell stood at the front of the room, his thin frame wrapped in a brown tweed jacket that matched his carefully combed hair. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the fluorescent lights as he scanned the room. "Today we'll hear your essays on cultural expressions," he announced, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that always made Zuri's stomach tighten. "Who would like to go first?" Before she could second-guess herself, Zuri's hand rose. Mr. Darnell's eyebrows lifted slightly, and he gestured for her to come forward. Standing before her classmates, Zuri took a deep breath. Her paper trembled slightly in her hands as she began to read. "My grandmother always says, 'Trouble dough set up like rain.'" In her voice, these words carry the rhythm of her childhood in Trinidad, the wisdom passed down through generations. As she read, her voice grew stronger. She explained how the phrase meant that trouble doesn't announce itself like rain does. You can't always see it coming, but you can prepare yourself for it. She wove in examples from her own life, from her family's history, from the strength she drew from these connections to her heritage. She was just reaching the heart of her essay when Mr. Darnell's sharp voice cut through her words. "That's quite enough, Miss Jacobs." Zuri faltered, looking up to find him wearing a smirk that made her chest tight. "While I appreciate your attempt," he said, emphasizing the word with a slight curl of his lip. This assignment was meant to demonstrate proper English usage. This urban nonsense has no place in academic writing. A few students snickered. Heat rushed to Zuri's face as Mr. Darnell took her paper, making a show of marking it with his red pen. The grade, a D-, stood out like an angry wound on her carefully typed pages. "Please take your seat," he said, holding out her essay. "Let's hear from someone who understands the assignment's requirements." Zuri's legs felt wooden as she walked back to her desk. She kept her eyes down, refusing to look at her classmates, refusing to let them see how much this hurt. The rest of the class passed in a blur of shame and anger, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind, but now they felt like a betrayal rather than a comfort. When the lunch bell finally rang, Zuri found Amara waiting for her in their usual spot in the cafeteria. One look at Zuri's face told Amara everything she needed to know. "What did he do?" Amara demanded, her beads clicking as she leaned forward. Zuri pulled out the essay, now crumpled from being clenched in her fist. As she explained what happened, Amara's expression darkened. "That racist," Amara started, her voice rising. "Shh," Zuri glanced around nervously. "We can't prove that's what it was." "Are you kidding?" Amara's eyes flashed. "He's been doing this all year. Remember when he told Marcus his poem about his grandfather's migration story was too ethnic? Or when he said Jenny's essay about her Korean family traditions was inappropriate for the classroom?" Zuri pushed her lunch tray away, no longer hungry. "I know, but we should tell Dad," Amara insisted, reaching for the essay. "No!" Zuri pulled it back quickly. "You know how he'll react. He'll go straight to the school board, and then everyone will say he's just playing favorites because we're his daughters." Amara sat back, crossing her arms. "So we're just supposed to let Darnell keep getting away with this?" "For now," Zuri said quietly, folding the essay and tucking it into her bag. "Just let me think about it, okay?" The twins gathered their things as the lunch period ended, both lost in thought. As they headed to their next class, Zuri tried to shake off the morning's humiliation, but her grandmother's words kept repeating in her mind. Troubled dough set up like rain. Maybe the trouble had been there all along, she thought, and she just hadn't wanted to see it. The afternoon sun streamed through the art room's tall windows, casting warm light across easels and work tables. Amara walked in clutching her portfolio close to her chest, her heartbeat quickening with each step. She'd spent weeks on this self-portrait, pouring her soul into every brushstroke, celebrating the rich, deep tones of her skin with careful attention to light and shadow. The classroom buzzed with nervous energy as students set up their pieces for critique. Amara noticed the art teacher's desk was empty, and her stomach dropped when Mr. Darnell walked in, his brown tweed jacket looking out of place among the paint-splattered tables. "Mrs. Reynolds is out sick today," he announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I'll be conducting the critique session." Amara's hands trembled slightly as she carefully removed her canvas from her portfolio. The portrait was striking. She had painted herself looking directly at the viewer, her dark skin glowing with subtle highlights, her eyes fierce and proud. She'd used deep browns and rich earth tones, building layers of color to capture the complexity of her complexion. "Let's begin with Amara," Mr. Darnell said, gesturing toward her easel. His voice carried that same dismissive tone she'd heard earlier in Zuri's English class. The other students gathered around her work. Sarah, a quiet girl with red hair, smiled encouragingly at Amara. A few others nodded appreciatively, but Amara could feel the tension in the air as Mr. Darnell stepped forward to examine her painting. He circled the easel slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. The silence stretched uncomfortably until he finally spoke. "The technique is adequate," he said, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it sound like an insult. "But the skin tone is far too dark. This isn't a shadow puppet show." A few students snickered. Sarah looked down at her shoes, her face flushing red. The comment hit Amara like a physical blow, stealing her breath. "If you're aiming for realism," Mr. Darnell continued, his voice dripping with false concern, "you might want to consider lightening the palette. As it stands, the features are barely distinguishable." Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak up, to defend her choices, to point out that this was exactly how her skin looked in natural light. But the words wouldn't come. Her hands shook as she began packing up her supplies, trying to ignore the mix of awkward glances and poorly hidden smirks from her classmates. The rest of the critique session passed in a blur. Amara sat at her desk, barely hearing Mr. Darnell's comments on other students' work. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, studying the various shades of brown in her own skin, the very colors she'd so carefully mixed and applied to her canvas. When the bell finally rang, Amara couldn't get out of the room fast enough. She found Zuri waiting in their usual spot in the hallway, but one look at Amara's face made Zuri's expression shift from greeting to concern. "What happened?" Zuri asked, reaching for her sister's arm. Amara's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Darnell. He subbed for Mrs. Reynolds." She explained what happened, her words coming faster as anger and hurt spilled out. "He said my skin was too dark, Zuri. Too dark, like I don't know what I look like?" Zuri's eyes welled up with tears, matching the ones Amara was trying desperately to hold back. "First my essay, now your painting," she said softly. "How many more times is he going to—" They didn't finish the sentence. They didn't need to. The twins walked home in silence, their footsteps heavy with the weight of the day's events. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows behind them, and Amara couldn't help but think about Mr. Darnell's shadow puppet comment, each step making her anger and hurt burn deeper. At home, they tried to go through their usual routine. They changed out of their uniforms, started their homework, and set the table for dinner. But when their father came home and asked about their day, the careful facade they'd built crumbled. "Girls?" Principal Jacobs asked, noticing their unusual quiet as they picked at their food. "What's wrong?" Amara looked at Zuri, who was staring intently at her plate. The events of the day suddenly felt too heavy to carry alone. "It's Mr. Darnell," Amara began, her voice breaking. "Today, in art class." The words poured out then from both twins. They told their father everything, about Zuri's essay and the urban nonsense comment, about Amara's portrait and the shadow puppet remark. They described the pattern they'd noticed with other students, the subtle ways Mr. Darnell undermined and dismissed their cultural expressions. As they spoke, tears finally fell freely down their cheeks. Principal Jacobs sat very still, his dinner forgotten, his face growing more serious with each word. "He makes us feel like we don't belong," Zuri said, wiping her eyes. "Like our voices don't matter." "Like our very skin is wrong," Amara added, her hands clenched in her lap. Their father reached across the table, taking each of their hands in his. His own eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I am so sorry you've been carrying this alone," he said, "but I am so proud of you for telling me now." The twins squeezed their father's hands, drawing strength from his touch and the love in his voice. The weight of the day's event still hung heavy in the air, but sharing it had loosened its grip on their hearts, if only a little. Principal Jacobs sat at the dinner table, his expression carefully neutral as he listened to his daughters pour out their pain. His hands remained steady as he reached for his phone, opening the Notes app to document their words with methodical precision. The only sign of his inner turmoil was a slight tightening around his eyes as Zuri described Mr. Darnell's sneering dismissal of her essay. "And then in art class," Amara continued, her voice still shaky, "he said my self-portrait was too dark, like it was wrong to paint myself the way I actually look." Jacobs typed each detail into his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. The girls exchanged confused glances at their father's unusual calmness. They had expected anger, perhaps even an immediate call to action. Instead, he sat there quiet and composed, occasionally nodding as they spoke. "What about other students?" he asked, his voice measured and professional. "Have you noticed similar treatment?" "Sarah Martinez did a presentation in Spanish last month," Zuri recalled. "Mr. Darnell made her repeat everything in English, saying her accent was too thick, even though everyone understood her perfectly. And remember when Jason Chen wrote about his grandmother's immigration story?" Amara added. "Mr. Darnell called it melodramatic," and suggested he write about something more universal. Principal Jacobs documented each incident with the same careful attention. When the girls finally finished speaking, their words hanging heavy in the air, he looked up from his phone and gave them a gentle smile. "Thank you for telling me," he said simply. The twins stared at him, clearly expecting more. But their father just stood up and began clearing the dinner plates, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That's it?" Amara asked, her voice small. "You're not going to do anything?" "I heard everything you said," he assured them, his tone still remarkably even. "Now, don't you both have homework to finish?" The girls retreated to their rooms, whispering to each other about their father's unexpected reaction. Once their footsteps faded upstairs, Jacob's calm demeanor shifted slightly. His shoulders tensed as he walked to his home office, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He sat at his desk and pulled out a small key from his wallet. The bottom drawer of his filing cabinet opened smoothly, revealing neat folders and a black USB drive. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began pulling out documents, printed emails dating back several years, handwritten complaints, and meeting notes that had never made it into official records. The first email was from 2018, from a parent whose daughter had come home crying after Mr. Darnell suggested she tone down her natural hair for a class presentation. Another complaint from 2019 detailed how he had consistently interrupted and talked over students of color during class discussions. Each document told a similar story, building a pattern that had somehow slipped through the cracks of administrative oversight. Jacob spread the papers across his desk, creating a timeline of incidents. His phone screen lit up with a familiar number as he dialed, and he waited as it rang 3 times. "Marcus?" "It's Elijah Jacobs," he said when the line connected. "I know it's late, but I need your help with something important." The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Washington, a former colleague who now worked in the district's civil rights office. They had started teaching together 20 years ago, before either of them moved into administration. "You remember those concerns we discussed a few years back?" Jacobs continued, his fingers tracing the edge of an old complaint form. "About certain patterns of behavior in the English department? I think it's time we revisited that conversation." He outlined the situation, including his daughter's experiences and the archived complaints. Marcus listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "Send me everything you have," Marcus said finally. "Every email, every note, every form that never made it past the previous administration. We'll need to build this case carefully." Jacob spent the next 2 hours scanning documents and organizing files. The USB drive contained video clips from previous parent-teacher conferences, showing subtle but clear instances of Mr. Darnell's dismissive behavior toward families of color. He attached everything to a secure email and sent it to Marcus. When he finally went upstairs to check on the girls, he found them both asleep at their desks, homework spread out around them. He gently woke them and helped them to their beds, just as he had when they were small. "Dad," Zuri mumbled sleepily, "are you really not going to do anything about Mr. Darnell?" He kissed her forehead. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the most effective actions are the ones you don't see coming." The next morning, Principal Jacobs maintained his usual routine. He made breakfast for the girls, checked their homework, and kissed them goodbye as they headed off to school. Nothing in his demeanor suggested that anything was different about this particular Tuesday. But when he arrived at school, he didn't follow his normal path to the administrative offices. Instead, he turned down the corridor leading to the basement level where the IT department was housed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he approached the tech support desk where Mrs. Chen, the head of IT, was already at work. "Good morning, Linda," he said, his voice pleasant but firm. "I need access to the archived classroom footage from the past semester. Specifically, every class where Mr. Darnell has taught." Mrs. Chen looked up from her computer, her expression questioning but professional. "That's quite a lot of footage, Principal Jacobs. Any particular time frames or incidents I should focus on?" "All of it," he replied, pulling out a USB drive. "Every class, every interaction, and I'll need the audio as well." She nodded, recognizing the serious intent behind his casual tone. It'll take some time to compile everything. The system automatically archives footage for 90 days. Take all the time you need, Jacob said, but I'd appreciate if we could keep this between us for now. Mrs. Chen turned to her computer and began typing. Of course, Principal Jacobs. I'll let you know as soon as it's ready. He watched as she accessed the security system, her fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard. On her screen, multiple windows opened, showing thumbnail images of classrooms from different angles. In one frame, he could see Mr. Darnell's English classroom, the camera positioned to capture both the teacher's desk and the student seating area. Principal Jacobs sat in his office, surrounded by multiple computer screens displaying classroom footage. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow as he methodically reviewed each video, his expression remaining neutral even as his pen moved steadily across his notepad. On one screen, Mr. Darnell stood at the front of his classroom, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Perhaps, he was saying to a student wearing a hijab, you'd be more comfortable in the back row where your traditional attire won't block anyone's view. The student quietly gathered her things and moved, her shoulders hunched. Jacobs paused the video and added another note to his growing list. He cross-referenced the date with a complaint form from his locked drawer, one that had mysteriously never made it to his desk when he was vice principal. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Another clip showed Darnell reviewing student presentations. Your topic is a bit... He paused, smirking slightly. Exotic for this assignment. Maybe choose something more mainstream next time. The Korean student at the front of the class clutched her family history project tighter, her face flushing as she returned to her seat. The principal's office remained quiet except for the soft whir of computer fans and the scratch of his pen. He had canceled his regular meetings, citing administrative duties. Nobody questioned it. They were used to his thorough approach to school management. At 2:15 p.m., Ms. Rodriguez, a veteran English teacher, knocked softly on his door. Jacobs had asked her to stop by during her planning period. She settled into the chair across from his desk, fidgeting slightly with her bracelet. Thank you for meeting with me, Jacobs said, his voice professional but gentle. I wanted to discuss some observations about departmental dynamics. Ms. Rodriguez glanced at the closed door before speaking. This is about David, isn't it? Mr. Darnell? Jacobs simply nodded, waiting. She took a deep breath. Last semester, during our faculty meeting about dress code enforcement, he made a comment about Jasmine Williams's braids, called them a distraction, and suggested we need stricter guidelines about ethnic hairstyles. Her voice grew quieter. Nobody said anything. We all just let it slide. Jacobs typed her statement into his laptop, maintaining his composed demeanor. Has there been anything else? Many things, she admitted. Small comments, looks, the way he grades certain students. But whenever anyone brought it up to the previous administration, the complaints seemed to disappear. An hour later, Mr. Chen from the math department sat in the same chair. His testimony painted a similar picture. When you were vice principal, Mr. Chen explained, a lot of things never made it to your desk. The old principal, he had a way of making problems go away, especially when it came to David. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. There was an incident 3 years ago with a group of parents who wanted to file a formal complaint. Somehow their emails got marked as spam. Their calls were never returned. Jacobs maintained his professional composure, but his fingers tightened slightly on his pen as he took notes. After Mr. Chen left, he spent the next hour drafting an email. He chose his words carefully, reviewing each sentence multiple times before adding recipients. 2 school board members known for their integrity, and 3 legal observers from the district's civil rights office. The email was brief but precise, requesting a confidential review meeting regarding ongoing concerns about discriminatory practices and policy violations. Documentation and evidence will be provided. Proposed date, next Tuesday, 3 p.m. He clicked send, then turned back to his computer screens. As he continued reviewing footage, he created a new folder on his desktop labeled Documentation, Confidential Testimonies. Into it went video clips, scanned complaints, and transcribed statements, each carefully dated and annotated. The sun had set by the time Jacobs finally drove home. In his home office, he opened his laptop one last time. The video that played showed Zuri's English class from the previous day. He watched as his daughter stood at the front of the room, her voice clear and confident as she began reading her essay. Then came Darnell's interruption, his dismissive wave, the smirk that played across his face as he called her work urban nonsense. The camera angle captured everything, the way Zuri's shoulders tensed, the quiet snickers from some students, the uncomfortable glances exchanged by others. Most telling was Darnell's expression, not one of genuine criticism, but of satisfaction as he watched Zuri return to her seat, diminished. Jacobs's face remained calm as he watched, years of administrative experience helping him maintain his professional mask. But his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache, and his hands, resting on his desk, had curled into fists. He closed the laptop with deliberate care. The room was dark except for his desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, his breathing measured and controlled. "This ends now," he whispered into the quiet room, his voice barely audible but filled with absolute certainty. The red folder on his desk, labeled Documentation Confidential Testimonies, in his precise handwriting, held within it the culmination of years of buried incidents, dismissed complaints, and overlooked injustices. Tomorrow, he would add the final pieces of evidence, but for now, it stood as a testament to his methodical approach and his unwavering determination to protect not just his daughters, but every student who had ever sat in David Darnell's classroom feeling less than they were. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Principal Jacobs pulled into the empty school parking lot. His footsteps echoed through the quiet hallways as he made his way to his office, his leather briefcase heavy with the documentation he'd gathered over the past 2 days. He settled into his chair and powered up his computer, the familiar startup chime breaking the pre-dawn silence. As he waited for his email to load, he pulled out the red folder, now bulging with printed testimonies and screenshots. His phone buzzed softly on the desk, a message from the district's civil rights office. "We're in. Send us the list." Jacobs took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He opened a new document and began typing, his expression focused as years of buried incidents surfaced in his memory. First came the names from his earliest days as vice principal. Marcus Thompson, grade 11, transferred out after Darnell questioned his commitment to academic excellence, despite maintaining a 3.8 GPA. Sarah Martinez, grade 10, switched to homeschooling after being repeatedly singled out for attitude problems in class discussions. He cross-referenced his notes with old email threads, carefully documenting dates and specific incidents. Jamal Wilson, who'd filed a complaint about unfair grading practices that mysteriously vanished from the system. Maya Patel, whose parents had requested a meeting about Darnell's concerning comments regarding their cultural traditions, a meeting that was never scheduled. The list grew longer as he worked through more recent cases. He noted patterns in Darnell's behavior, the subtle undermining of confident students, the coded language used in performance reviews, the way certain complaints were minimized or dismissed entirely. A new email arrived from Andrea Chen, class of 2019. Her message was detailed and painful. It wasn't just one big thing you could point to. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. A dismissive look here, a backhanded compliment there. The way he'd praise white students for the same things he criticized us for. By the end of the year, I just stopped raising my hand altogether. Jacobs added her testimony to the document, his jaw tightening as he remembered how bright and engaged Andrea had been as a freshman, and how quiet she'd become by senior year. Around mid-morning, he paused his work to send a text to his daughters. "How are you both doing?" Zuri's response came quickly. "We're fine. Just tired." He stared at those 4 words, reading between the lines. The fatigue wasn't physical. It was the exhaustion that came from maintaining composure in the face of constant subtle aggression, from second-guessing every interaction, from carrying the weight of representation on young shoulders. By early afternoon, the list had grown to include over 30 detailed accounts spanning Darnell's tenure at the school. Each entry was meticulously documented with dates, witnesses, and supporting evidence where available. Jacobs had also noted the outcomes. Students who'd switched classes, transferred schools, or simply withdrawn from participation. At 2:30 p.m., he received a text from Ms. Valencia Rowe, one of the school board members he'd contacted. She could meet him after school hours, away from curious eyes. They arranged to meet in the small conference room in the library's reference section, a space rarely used this late in the day. Ms. Valencia arrived precisely at 4:15 p.m., her legal pad tucked under her arm, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming," Jacob said, closing the door behind her. "Of course." She settled into one of the chairs, her posture professional but her eyes holding a hint of personal investment. "Your email mentioned evidence of ongoing concerns?" Jacobs nodded and opened his laptop, pulling up the surveillance footage from Zuri's class. As they watched, Valencia's composed expression began to crack. Her hand covered her mouth when Darnell dismissed Zuri's essay as urban nonsense. "This is from Monday," Jacobs explained quietly. "But it's not an isolated incident." He showed her more clips. Darnell's interaction with the student in hijab, his dismissal of the Korean student's presentation, his subtle but constant undermining of students of color. Then he handed her the list. Valencia's eyes moved down the page, widening as she recognized certain names. When she reached one particular entry, her breath caught. "Marcus Thompson," she said softly. "That's my son." Jacobs nodded. "I remember his case. The complaint that disappeared." Valencia's professional demeanor cracked further as she continued reading. "These patterns, they're so clear when you see them all together like this." She wiped quickly at her eyes. But at the time, each incident seemed so small, so hard to prove. Marcus kept telling me something wasn't right, but Darnell was always so careful with his wording when I'd come in for conferences. She reached the most recent entries, including Zuri's and Amara's experiences. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the papers down. "I'll be there next Tuesday," she said firmly. "And I'm bringing copies of every email exchange I had with the previous administration about Marcus." I kept them all. She looked up at Jacobs, her eyes now clear and determined. "This has gone on long enough." Jacobs checked his phone as they wrapped up their meeting. The second board member had confirmed their attendance, and both legal observers from the district had replied with their commitment to be present. "We'll need to be discreet until Tuesday," he reminded Valencia as she gathered her things. "Darnell has friends on the board, and I don't want anything compromising this review." She nodded, her professional mask back in place. "Of course, I'll see you next week, Principal Jacobs." After she left, Jacobs sat alone in the conference room for a moment, looking at the list of names on his laptop screen. Each one represented a student who had faced what his daughters were facing now: the subtle erosion of confidence, the quiet questioning of their own worth, the exhaustion of navigating spaces where they were made to feel less than. He saved the document one final time and attached it to an email addressed to the Civil Rights Office. His cursor hovered over the send button for just a moment before he clicked, setting the next phase of his plan in motion. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the empty hallway, as Principal Jacobs stood quietly near the staff lounge entrance, his presence concealed by the partially closed door. Inside, the morning chatter of teachers preparing for their day filled the room, punctuated by the distinct sound of Mr. Darnell's voice rising above the rest. "You wouldn't believe what counts as offensive these days," Darnell said, making air quotes with his fingers as he stirred his coffee. "Back in my day, students actually focused on learning instead of looking for reasons to be hurt." A few teachers chuckled nervously while others busied themselves with their phones or paperwork. Darnell leaned against the counter, clearly enjoying his audience. "Just yesterday, one of them complained about my feedback on their writing, apparently pointing out that slang isn't appropriate for academic work is culturally insensitive now." He rolled his eyes dramatically. "These kids need to toughen up if they want to survive in the real world." Jacobs remained motionless in the hallway, his expression neutral as he made mental notes. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the floor, and he could see Darnell's animated gestures reflected on the polished tiles. Later that morning, Jacobs invited Miss Thompson, a younger white English teacher, into his office. She sat nervously in the chair across from his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've noticed some concerning patterns in student feedback," Jacobs began carefully. "I was wondering if you've observed anything similar in your interactions with other faculty members." Ms. Thompson glanced at the closed door before speaking. "There have been comments," she said softly, "especially in the veteran teachers group chat." Jacobs leaned forward slightly. "Group chat? They call it the real teacher's room," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Darnell started it a few years ago. It's mostly the older teachers who've been here longer than 10 years. She hesitated. "They share things there that they wouldn't say in regular staff meetings." Throughout the day, Jacobs spoke with other white teachers who shared similar stories. Mr. Peterson, a science teacher in his 4th year, admitted to leaving the group chat after seeing some of the messages. "It made me uncomfortable," Peterson explained, running a hand through his graying hair. "But Darnell has friends on the board, and I'm still working toward tenure. I didn't want to rock the boat." Mrs. Andrews, a math teacher nearing retirement, provided more details. "At first it seemed like just a place to vent about administrative changes," she said. "But then the comments about certain students started. The way they'd mock their names, their families, their culture." She shook her head. "I should have said something sooner." By early afternoon, 3 teachers had quietly forwarded Jacob's screenshots from the group chat. Each message revealed another layer of the toxic culture Darnell had cultivated among certain faculty members. At precisely 2:15 p.m., Darnell's computer pinged with a new calendar invitation. The subject line read, "Performance Review, Monday at 10 a.m. The location was listed as the main conference room, with both board members and district representatives included in the attendee list. Darnell spotted fellow veteran teacher Mr. Richards in the copy room and couldn't resist sharing the news. "Finally getting that performance review," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "About time they recognize who really keeps this place running." Richards shuffled uncomfortably as he collected his papers. "That's good news, David." "Of course it is," Darnell continued, either missing or ignoring his colleague's discomfort. "With all these new, inclusive policies trying to water down our standards, they need experienced teachers like me more than ever." He straightened his tie with a self-satisfied smile. "Someone has to maintain academic excellence around here." That evening, Principal Jacobs arrived home to find Amara and Zuri sitting at the kitchen table, their homework spread out before them, but clearly untouched. The girls' usual animated chatter was replaced by a heavy silence. "Dad," Amara began, her voice tight with emotion, "things are getting worse at school." Zuri nodded, picking at the corner of her notebook. "Some kids are saying we're just being dramatic, that we're trying to get Mr. Darnell fired because we can't handle constructive criticism." "Madison told everyone in study hall that we're playing the race card," Amara added, anger and hurt mixing in her voice. "And Tyler said his parents think students like us are ruining the school's reputation with all our complaints." Jacob set his briefcase down slowly, the weight of his daughter's words settling heavily in his chest. He pulled out a chair and sat between them, noting how Zuri's shoulders hunched inward and how Amara's hands were clenched into fists beneath the table. "Jason said his mom heard that Mr. Darnell might get in trouble," Zuri continued quietly. "He said we're too sensitive and that we're probably making things up for attention." "And now some kids who used to be friendly are avoiding us," Amara said, her voice cracking slightly, "like they're afraid being seen with us might get them in trouble too." Jacobs looked at his daughters, really looked at them. He saw the fatigue in their eyes, the tension in their postures, the way they seemed smaller somehow, as if trying to take up less space in their own home. The familiar urge to tell them everything, to explain his careful plans for justice, pressed against his chest. But he knew the importance of protecting them from potential backlash. Instead, he opened his arms, and both girls moved into his embrace. He held them tightly, feeling their shoulders shake with silent tears. "I'm so proud of you both," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions in his heart. "So proud of your strength, your dignity, your truth." They stayed like that for a long moment, the setting sun casting warm light through the kitchen windows, their homework forgotten on the table. Jacobs held his daughters close, carrying the weight of what he knew and what he couldn't yet share, while silently promising them that change was coming. The Friday afternoon sun cast long shadows through Principal Jacobs' office windows as he sat at his desk, waiting. The school hallways had grown quiet, most students and staff already headed home for the weekend. Only the distant hum of the janitor's floor buffer broke the silence. A soft knock at his door made him look up. Marcus Chen from the IT department stood there, holding a laptop and an external hard drive. "I've got what you asked for, Principal Jacobs," Marcus said quietly, closing the door behind him. "It wasn't easy, but that old device Mrs. Rodriguez turned in when she resigned last month, she never logged out of the group chat. We were able to recover everything." Jacobs nodded, gesturing for Marcus to sit. "And you're certain about the privacy settings?" "Yes, sir. The chat was invitation only, completely separate from school emails. They were careful about that." Marcus connected the hard drive to Jacobs' computer. But they weren't careful enough about their digital footprints. As Marcus pulled up the archived messages, Jacobs felt his stomach tighten. The chat window opened to reveal years of conversations between veteran teachers, dating back to when Darnell first created the group. The scroll bar seemed endless. "I'll leave you to it," Marcus said, standing. He paused at the door. "Sir, some of what's in there, it's pretty rough." Once alone, Jacobs began reading. The first few messages seemed innocent enough. Complaints about paperwork, jokes about faculty meetings, discussions about curriculum changes. But as he scrolled further, the true nature of the real teacher's room emerged. A message from 3 years ago caught his eye. Darnell had written, "Another diversity training today, because apparently teaching proper English is now racist. When did having standards become a crime?" The responses made Jacob's jaw clench. These kids don't want to learn anyway, too busy making TikToks. Remember when we could actually fail students who deserved it? They'll just claim discrimination and get pushed through anyway. Jacobs methodically took screenshots, organizing them by date and severity. He found threads discussing how to write behavior referrals that wouldn't trigger discrimination reviews. Conversations about which students were worth the effort and which ones were lost causes. The casual cruelty was wrapped in professional-sounding language, but the intent was clear. One particularly active thread from last year made his blood run cold. Darnell had posted, "When they say cultural differences, what they really mean is lower the bar. These kids need firm boundaries, not coddling." Another teacher had replied, "Exactly. My urban students always have excuses for late work. But if I don't accept them, I'm the bad guy." The messages grew worse as Jacobs dug deeper. He found coded references to students' appearances, mockery of names that weren't traditional, and thinly veiled jokes about families from certain neighborhoods. Each message revealed another layer of the toxic culture these teachers had maintained behind closed digital doors. Then he found the meme. Darnell had shared a photo of a black student sleeping at his desk, clearly taken without permission. The caption read, "Future rapper in training. At least he's got a backup career." The responses included laughing emojis and similar jokes about other students. Jacobs's printer hummed steadily as he carefully selected and printed the most damning evidence. Each page felt heavy with significance as he added them to his growing folder. The red label, "Documentation, Confidential Testimonies," seemed to glow in the fading afternoon light. Some messages were particularly calculating. Teachers discussed how to grade problem students in ways that wouldn't attract attention. Give them just enough points to avoid complaints, but keep them humble. Others shared tips on using words like disruptive, unfocused, and challenging in student reports, terms that seemed professional but carried loaded meanings. Darnell appeared in nearly every controversial thread, often instigating or encouraging the worst conversations. His messages showed a pattern of targeting specific students, particularly those from minority backgrounds. He had even created a nickname system for referring to students without using names, a clear attempt to avoid detection if the messages ever leaked. As the sun set outside his office window, Jacobs carefully organized the final prints. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of systematic discrimination, carefully hidden behind professional facades and academic standards. The folder now contained not just individual incidents, but proof of a coordinated culture of bias. With steady hands, Jacobs scanned every document, creating secure digital copies. He encrypted the files following the district's highest security protocols, then composed a brief email to the civil rights team. Additional evidence attached, highly sensitive content, please confirm receipt. After receiving confirmation that the files had been safely delivered and secured, Jacobs opened his notebook to a fresh page. The paper was crisp and white under his office lamp. With deliberate strokes, he wrote in bold letters at the top, "Final moves, weekend strategy." The words stood stark against the blank page, representing not just a plan, but a promise. A promise to his daughters, to every student who had suffered in silence, to every parent who had felt powerless, and to himself, that this pattern of behavior would end, not with a whisper, but with justice. The Saturday morning sun filtered through the library's tall windows, casting warm patches of light across the study tables where Amara and Zuri sat with their textbooks spread out before them. They had chosen a quiet corner, hoping to lose themselves in their history project about the civil rights movement. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Amara sketched preliminary ideas for their presentation poster, while Zuri typed notes on her laptop. Every few minutes, new students would enter the library, and the twins could feel eyes landing on them, followed by hushed conversations. "Did you hear about Mr. Darnell?" "I heard the principal's daughters." "They're probably just trying to get attention." Zuri's fingers paused over her keyboard. She glanced at Amara, who was pressing her pencil so hard against the paper that the tip snapped. Without a word, Zuri reached into her pencil case and handed her sister a new one. They had gotten good at these silent exchanges of support. A group of students from their English class settled at a nearby table, their whispers carrying just loud enough to be heard. "My mom says if Darnell gets fired, she's calling the school board. He's been here forever." Amara's hand tightened around her new pencil, but she kept sketching. Zuri typed louder, drowning out the whispers with the click-clack of keys. They had promised each other they wouldn't let anyone see them crack. Not here. Not now. Meanwhile, at home, Principal Jacobs sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and 3 different laptops. He had been up since dawn, reviewing every piece of evidence with the thoroughness of a surgeon. Each document was tagged with colored sticky notes: yellow for direct discrimination, blue for pattern behavior, red for serious incidents. He picked up a statement from 2019, reading it for the 3rd time. A student had reported Darnell for saying her name was too ethnic and suggesting she go by something more professional. The complaint had mysteriously vanished from official records, but Jacobs had kept his own copy. His phone buzzed, a text from the district civil rights office. "Review team standing by. Monday's meeting is cleared for recording." Jacobs reached for his presentation notes. He had organized the evidence chronologically, building a case that showed not just individual incidents, but a calculated pattern of behavior. The visual aids were arranged on foam boards, screenshots, statistics, and timeline graphics that made the data impossible to ignore. His hands shook slightly as he dialed a number he'd been staring at all morning. After 3 rings, a soft voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Thompson, this is Principal Jacobs from Riverside High." A pause. "I've been expecting your call. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I know this isn't easy." "It's been 5 years," she said, her voice tight. "I was a junior when it happened, after Mr. Darnell's comments about my college essays being unrealistic dreams." Jacobs closed his eyes, remembering the incident report. Sarah Thompson, former honor student, found in her bathroom after swallowing a bottle of pills. The note she left mentioned feeling worthless and not good enough. "Your voice matters, Sarah, but only if you're ready to share it." He heard her take a deep breath. "I'll record my statement. These kids today, your daughters, they deserve better than what I got." By late afternoon, Jacobs had received Sarah's video statement. Her words were clear, composed, devastating in their simplicity. He added it to his presentation folder, knowing its power. The sun was setting when Zuri returned home, heading straight to her room for a video call with her study group. But as soon as she joined, she realized it wasn't about studying at all. "I bet they're just jealous because Darnell actually grades fairly," one voice said. "My sister had him last year. She says he's strict but fair." "Yeah, well, watch out. Soon Principal Jacobs will probably fire every white teacher next." Laughter crackled through her speakers. Zuri's finger hovered over the disconnect button, her chest tight. She left the call without a word, then opened her messages to Amara. "We have to make this count." Across the hall, Amara stared at her sister's text, understanding all the weight behind those 6 words. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about Sarah Thompson, about every student who'd ever sat in Darnell's class feeling less than human, about the next generation who would sit in those same desks. The weekend hours ticked by slowly. Jacobs barely slept, checking and double-checking every detail. He knew Darnell would come prepared with his own defense, years of satisfactory evaluations, letters from supportive parents, maybe even students willing to speak on his behalf. But Jacobs had something more powerful, truth in its rawest form. Unedited security footage showing subtle humiliations, chat logs revealing casual cruelty, testimonies from students who had carried these wounds into adulthood. Sunday night arrived with a heavy silence. The dining room table had become a war room, every surface covered with evidence of a system that had failed too many children for too long. Jacobs stood over it all, his shadow stretching across years of documented pain. The red folder sat in the center like a heart pumping life into all the surrounding evidence. Inside were the most damning pieces: the chat logs, Sarah's testimony, the meme that crossed every ethical line. Jacobs reached out and touched its smooth surface, feeling the weight of responsibility in his fingertips. Moving to the window, he looked out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, Darnell was probably preparing his own defense, unaware of just how much evidence had been gathered. Unaware that his years of careful coding and hidden prejudice were about to be exposed. Jacobs's reflection stared back at him from the dark glass as he whispered, "No turning back." Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill. At precisely 10 a.m., Mr. Darnell's polished shoes clicked confidently down the hallway toward Principal Jacobs' office. His silk tie was perfectly knotted, his silver hair neatly combed. 27 years of teaching had taught him how these reviews went. A few formalities, some praise for his experience, perhaps a gentle suggestion or two. Nothing he couldn't handle with his usual charm. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and practiced his modest smile, the one that had deflected countless complaints over the years. As he reached for the door handle, he was already rehearsing his standard lines about maintaining academic excellence and not lowering standards. The smile froze on his face as he stepped inside. Principal Jacobs sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't Jacobs that made Darnell's confident stride falter. It was the unexpected audience arranged in a semicircle of chairs. To the left sat 2 women in sharp business suits, their district civil rights office badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Their laptops were open, fingers poised over keyboards. Next to them were 3 school board members, including Ms. Valencia Rowe, whose piercing gaze followed him as he entered. A recording device sat prominently on Jacobs' desk, its red light blinking steadily. And there, centered on the desk like a splash of blood against the dark wood, was a thick red folder marked "Confidential" in bold black letters. "Please have a seat, Mr. Darnell," Jacobs said, gesturing to the single chair positioned directly across from him. No warmth colored his words, no pretense of collegiality. Darnell's throat tightened, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. He settled into the chair, crossing his legs and trying to project an air of mild amusement. "Quite the gathering for a routine review," he said with a small laugh that no one returned. Without preamble, Jacobs reached for a remote control. The large screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, and Darnell's chest constricted as he recognized his own classroom. "Let's begin with last Monday," Jacobs said, pressing play. The footage was crystal clear. Zuri Jacobs stood at the front of the class, reading her essay with quiet dignity. Darnell watched himself interrupt her, saw his own smirk as he dismissed her grandmother's phrase as urban nonsense. The camera caught everything: the students' uncomfortable laughter, Zuri's face crumpling before she forced it blank, the way she seemed to shrink as she returned to her seat. Moving on to Tuesday, Jacobs continued, changing the clip. Now they were in the art room. Amara's portrait sat on the easel, beautiful, powerful, unapologetic in its celebration of her features. Darnell's voice came through the speakers with perfect clarity. Too dark on the skin tone. Make it more realistic. This isn't a shadow puppet show. Ms. Valencia's pen scratched across her notepad. One of the legal observers typed rapidly. Perhaps we should review March 15th. Jacobs didn't wait for a response before playing the next clip. A mixed-race student stood by Darnell's desk after class, clearly distressed. Darnell's voice dripped with condescension. Come now, Marcus. You're not black enough to complain about these things. Your mother is white, isn't she? Clip after clip played. A Latina girl presenting her essay, Darnell mocking her handwriting as too ethnic. A black student being told his vocabulary was surprisingly sophisticated. Each incident captured in high definition, each microaggression preserved in perfect audio. Darnell's collar felt tight. Sweat beaded at his temples. These clips are taken completely out of context, he stammered, tugging at his tie. You're misinterpreting normal classroom management. Context? Jacobs's voice was quiet but sharp. Let's discuss context, Mr. Darnell. He reached for the red folder. The sound of it opening seemed to echo in the silent room. One by one, Jacobs began laying out its contents. Printed emails spanning decades, student testimonies, mental health reports, transcript analyses showing systematic grade depression for students of color, screenshots from the Real Teacher's Room chat, including Darnell's racist memes and jokes. Would you like to explain the context of this? Jacobs held up the screenshot of the sleeping student Darnell had captioned, "Future rapper in training." Darnell's hands gripped his armrests. It was just a joke among colleagues. Or perhaps you'd like to provide context for Sarah Thompson's testimony. Jacobs pressed a button, and Sarah's face appeared on screen, her voice steady as she described how Darnell's constant belittlement had driven her to attempt suicide. The legal observers exchanged glances. Ms. Valencia's jaw clenched visibly. This is absurd, Darnell said, but his voice had lost its usual authority. You can't possibly. You have two options, Mr. Darnell. Jacobs leaned forward, placing both hands flat on his desk. Option 1, you resign immediately. You sign an NDA, you walk away quietly, and you spend your retirement reflecting on the lives you've damaged. Option 2, we take this public. Every clip, every email, every testimony. The lawsuit will be extensive, and the district's civil rights office will ensure your teaching license is permanently revoked. Darnell's face flushed red. The careful mask of professionalism he'd worn for decades cracked completely. You think you can scare me with this witch hunt? He spat. I've been teaching longer than you've been alive. I've survived 3 principals and 2 superintendents. You think you're the first person to try this? Jacobs rose slowly from his chair, his calm demeanor unchanged. No, Darnell. I don't think I'm the first. He placed both palms on his desk and leaned forward. I plan to be the last. I plan to bury you. Darnell's laugh was sharp and bitter. I won't resign. You'll have to fire me. The autumn sun had already set when Principal Jacobs pulled into his driveway that evening. His shoulders felt heavy, like they were carrying the weight of every student Darnell had ever hurt. The porch light cast a warm glow as he made his way to the front door, his briefcase stuffed with copies of the day's proceedings. Inside, Amara and Zuri were sitting at the kitchen table, homework spread out before them, but their books lay untouched, and their eyes fixed on him the moment he entered. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dad? Zuri's voice was barely above a whisper. How did it? Jacob set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. His daughters deserved to know something, even if he couldn't share everything. He pulled out a chair and sat between them, placing a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. I can't tell you all the details, he said carefully, But I want you both to know something." He looked each of them in the eye. "He won't get away with this. Not this time." Amara's fingers fidgeted with her pencil. "But he refused to resign, right? We heard some kids talking about it after school." "News travels fast," Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yes, he refused. But that's not the end of the story." He squeezed their shoulders. "Sometimes justice takes a little longer than we'd like, but it comes all the same." The girls exchanged glances, and Jacobs could see the mixture of hope and uncertainty in their eyes. They'd been let down by the system before. They all had. "Try to get some sleep," he told them, standing up. "Tomorrow's another day." Later that night, as Jacobs was reviewing some final paperwork in his home office, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Valencia. "Check social media, now." Frowning, he opened the school's unofficial student news account. His eyes widened at what he saw. There, at the top of the feed, was a video. The footage was clearly taken from outside his office window, partially obscured by blinds but still visible. The clip was muted, but it didn't need sound to tell its story. The camera focused on Darnell's face as he watched the classroom footage play. His expressions shifted from smug confidence to shock, then anger, and finally, unmistakable fear. The caption read simply, "The truth comes out." No more silence. Jacobs watched it 3 times, his heart pounding. He hadn't authorized this. He hadn't even known anyone was filming. The video was already gaining traction, with hundreds of shares and comments pouring in by the minute. Finally, I knew it wasn't just in my head. Remember when he told Maria her accent was too thick to give presentations? This explains why he always graded my papers harder than everyone else's. The stories kept coming like a dam had broken. Current students, former students, even parents were chiming in with their own experiences. Each comment seemed to encourage more people to speak up. Jacobs barely slept that night. He kept checking the video's spread, watching as it moved from the school's social circles to wider community groups. By dawn, local parent forums were buzzing with discussions about systemic racism in education. Tuesday morning arrived with a different energy in the school hallways. Students gathered in small clusters, phones out, voices hushed but intense. Some looked shocked, others nodded with grim satisfaction. A few were crying, finally feeling seen, finally having proof that they weren't too sensitive or imagining things. At 7:45 a.m. sharp, Jacobs's email pinged with an urgent message from the superintendent. "Did you leak this? The board is in chaos, parents are calling, media outlets are requesting comments. We need to contain this immediately. Call me ASAP." Jacobs stared at his screen, genuinely confused. He hadn't leaked anything. He'd been meticulously careful about documentation and confidentiality. He immediately pulled up the security footage from outside his office, scanning through Monday's recordings. That's when he saw it. A figure crouching beneath his window during the review meeting, phone held steady, filming through the gaps in the blinds. The angle was perfect to capture Darnell's face while remaining hidden from view. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I did what you couldn't. Don't worry. I used my mom's old phone and a burner account. They can't trace it. Some things need to be seen to be believed. Negative EVA, Avenida Alicia Valencia." Ms. Valencia's daughter, a junior who had transferred schools last year after Darnell had repeatedly dismissed her complaints about racial harassment from other students. Jacob sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The video wasn't the way he'd planned to handle things. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't professional. But as he watched another group of students walk past his office, heads held higher than he'd seen in months, he couldn't bring himself to be angry. Sometimes justice found its own path. His phone rang. The superintendent again. Jacobs took a deep breath and picked up the receiver, ready to handle whatever came next. The truth was out now, raw and unfiltered, exactly as the students had lived it. There would be no more hiding behind closed doors, no more misunderstandings or context to hide behind. Through his office window, he could see Amara and Zuri arriving at school. They walked differently today, straighter, stronger. Other students were approaching them, sharing quiet words of support. Even some of the ones who had laughed at them last week looked ashamed now. The superintendent's voice crackled through the phone. "Elijah? Are you there? This is a disaster." Jacobs watched his daughters disappear into the building, then turned his attention to the call. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't a disaster. This is accountability." The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside High's front lawn as news vans lined up along the street. Camera crews huddled near the school's entrance, their equipment gleaming in the early light. Principal Jacobs watched from his office window as reporters checked their microphones and adjusted their blazers, preparing for their morning segments. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. National news outlets, education blogs, civil rights organizations, everyone wanted a statement. The viral video of Darnell's confrontation had exploded overnight, gaining millions of views and sparking heated debates across social media platforms. Jacobs straightened his tie and grabbed the stack of printed emails he'd prepared for the emergency staff meeting. The weight of them felt like lead in his hands. As he walked through the hallways, he could feel the tension in the air. Students whispered in clusters, some pointing at their phones, others casting nervous glances at passing teachers. The staff lounge was packed when he arrived. Teachers filled every chair, with some standing against the walls. The usual morning chatter was absent, replaced by a heavy silence. Darnell's empty seat near the front seemed to draw every eye in the room. "Good morning," Jacobs began, his voice steady despite the chaos churning in his stomach. "I know you've all seen the news. I know you have questions. But first, we need to discuss how we're going to maintain order and support our students during this time." Before he could continue, his phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the district's legal team. He opened it, and his jaw tightened as he read the subject line. "Notice of legal action, David Darnell versus Riverside High School." A teacher near the back raised her hand. "Principal Jacobs, we've just received an email from Mr. Darnell's attorneys. He's filing a countersuit for reverse discrimination and character assassination. What should we tell our students?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Jacobs could see the lines being drawn. Some teachers nodded in agreement with Darnell's claims, while others looked disgusted. "We tell them the truth," Jacobs replied firmly, "that this administration takes all allegations of discrimination seriously, and that we're committed to creating a safe learning environment for every student." His phone buzzed again. This time it was worse, a statement from the teachers' union. As he scanned the message, his heart sank. The union was threatening to withdraw legal support unless he retracted his accusations against Darnell. Meanwhile, across the school, Amara sat in her art class trying to focus on her sketch. Her new art teacher, Mrs. Peterson, approached her desk with an uncomfortable expression. "Amara," she whispered, glancing around nervously, "could I speak with you in the hall?" Once outside, Mrs. Peterson's friendly demeanor shifted. "Listen, honey, I know things are tense right now. Maybe it would be better if you kept your head down for a while. Your work is wonderful, but perhaps choose less controversial subjects?" Amara's throat tightened. She looked down at her sketch, a powerful piece about identity and resistance. Without a word, she walked back into the classroom, her hands trembling as she packed up her supplies. In English class, Zuri faced her own form of retaliation. As students broke into groups for a project, she found herself sitting alone. Her usual partners avoided eye contact, quickly forming groups without her. The message was clear. She was now toxic by association. The day wore on and the pressure mounted. Board members called emergency meetings, split between supporting Jacobs and pushing for de-escalation. Some argued that the video's release had made the situation too volatile, while others insisted this was exactly why action was needed. The racism hadn't disappeared, it had merely changed form. Gone were the obvious slurs and overt discrimination. In their place came cold shoulders, whispered conversations that stopped when certain students walked by, and subtle exclusions that were harder to document but just as damaging. As evening approached, Jacob sat in his office watching the last news van pack up for the day. His computer screen displayed dozens of unread emails, including several from parents demanding his resignation. A soft knock at his door broke his concentration. Ms. Valencia entered, followed by two civil rights observers. They looked tired but determined. "Close the door," Jacob said quietly. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a USB drive. "There's something else you need to see." He plugged it into his computer and turned the screen so they could all view it. The IT department recovered these from the Real Teachers Room group chat. They were deleted, but not completely erased. He clicked through screenshot after screenshot of conversations between veteran teachers led by Darnell. The observers leaned forward, their expressions darkening as they read. Racist memes, jokes about urban students, complaints about lowering standards for certain demographics. Then came the most damning evidence, a direct comment from Darnell about Amara's artwork. "Look at this one trying to paint herself like she's special," Darnell had written, accompanied by a cruel emoji. Maybe if she'd lighten up the canvas and herself, she'd have a chance at real art school. Ms. Valencia's hands clenched into fists. When was this posted? 3 days before he criticized her painting in class, Jacobs replied. It proves premeditation, shows a pattern of targeted harassment. The civil rights observers exchanged glances, then nodded firmly. Use it, one said. We'll back you completely. This changes everything. The union can't ignore this, the other added, and the board won't be able to sweep it under the rug. Jacobs looked at the evidence on his screen, the final piece in a puzzle he'd been assembling for years. He thought of his daughters, of every student who'd ever been made to feel less than worthy, of every missing complaint and dismissed concern. Thank you, he said simply. The observers gathered their things, ready to prepare for the next phase of the investigation. Ms. Valencia lingered behind, her expression both worried and determined. They're going to come at you hard for this, she warned. Jacobs nodded, his resolve strengthening. The war had entered its next phase, and he was ready for whatever came next. The Wednesday morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the boardroom, casting long shadows across the polished oak table. Principal Jacobs stood at the head, his posture rigid as he faced the 7 board members seated before him. The air felt thick with tension, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Before we begin, Jacobs said, his voice steady and clear, I want to thank you all for meeting on such short notice. He placed a thick manila folder on the table, the edges crisp and new. What I'm about to show you goes beyond individual incidents. This is systematic, intentional, and documented. Board member Richard Thompson shifted in his leather chair, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. He'd been on the board for 15 years, and something in Jacobs's tone made his stomach turn. He knew about the chat group, had even been invited to join it once, though he'd declined. But he'd never reported it, never wanted to rock the boat. Jacobs began distributing copies of the screenshots, each page protected in a clear plastic sleeve. These messages span the last 3 years, he explained, watching as the board members began to read. They were recovered from a private group chat called the Real Teachers Room. The first reaction came from Ms. Valencia, who inhaled sharply at a particular message. Her hands trembled slightly as she read Darnell's words aloud. These kids aren't students, they're social experiments. The district can force us to take them, but they can't force us to pretend they belong here. Another board member, Dr. Chen, flipped to the next page and her face darkened. Look at this one, she said, her voice tight with anger. Bet she's gonna cry racism again next time she fails. This was about a student who filed a complaint last year, wasn't it? Thompson's face had grown pale. He recognized some of these conversations, remembered seeing notifications pop up on his phone when others had responded. He'd always told himself it was just teachers blowing off steam, nothing serious. But then came the artwork photo. Amara's self-portrait, her careful brushstrokes capturing the deep richness of her skin tones, the pride in her expression. Below it, Darnell's comment. National Geographic could use this. At least they pay good money for tribal art. The room erupted. This is disgusting. Dr. Chen slammed her hand on the table. We need to call our lawyers, another member cautioned. We could be liable. Liable? Ms. Valencia stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. We're already liable. Every day we let this continue, we're liable. Thompson found his voice, though it came out weaker than he intended. Maybe we should consider a quieter resolution, a resignation package perhaps. Jacobs had remained silent during the initial reactions, but now he stepped forward. His presence commanded attention, and the room fell quiet. "This is no longer internal," he said, each word deliberate and weighted. "This isn't about one teacher or one incident or one complaint. This is institutional. These messages show years of coordinated discrimination, documented proof of targeting specific students based on race. The Civil Rights Office already has copies. The media is involved. There is no quiet resolution anymore." He placed one final document on the table, a formal recommendation for immediate termination. "David Darnell will be dismissed with cause," Jacobs continued. "No pension, no references, no severance. And then we will begin the real work of examining how this was allowed to continue for so long." Thompson started a protest, but Ms. Valencia cut him off. "He's right, we vote now. Who's in favor?" Hands rose. First Ms. Valencia, then Dr. Chen. Others followed. Thompson looked around the room, realized he was about to be on the wrong side of history, and slowly raised his hand too. "Unanimous," Jacobs noted, though his expression showed no satisfaction. "I'll notify the district office immediately." The meeting adjourned, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Board members gathered their things in silence, some still clutching the damning screenshots, others avoiding eye contact as they hurried out. That evening, as the sun began to set, the district's legal team sent the official notification to Darnell. The email was brief, professional, and final. His termination proceedings would begin immediately. 23 years of teaching would end not with a retirement party, but with a formal dismissal for cause. The sky had turned a deep purple when Jacobs finally arrived home. He found Amara and Zuri sitting on the front porch, homework spread out around them but clearly untouched. They looked up as he approached, their expressions a mix of hope and uncertainty. He settled onto the porch step between them, his tie loosened, his shoulders finally allowing themselves to slump slightly. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Zuri leaned against her father's shoulder. "Did we win?" she whispered, her voice small but steady. Jacobs wrapped an arm around each of his daughters, pulling them close. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, their sound growing louder as they approached the school. He knew what they would find: the fresh spray paint on the school fence, stark red letters spelling out liars across the brick surface. "Not yet," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "But the doors finally open." The sirens grew louder, their blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of nearby houses, casting alternating shadows across the family as they sat together on the porch. The Thursday morning sun struggled to break through heavy clouds, casting a grim light on the school's defaced front gate. Bold red letters screamed "Liars" across the metal surface, accompanied by "Race baiters" and "Fire him back" in angry strokes of black spray paint. The sight stopped staff members in their tracks as they arrived for the day. Ms. Peterson, the chemistry teacher, pulled out her phone and snapped pictures with trembling hands. "This is just awful," she muttered to no one in particular. Mr. Rodriguez, who taught Spanish, turned away and hurried inside, his shoulders hunched. Others lingered uncertainly, forming small clusters of whispered conversations. When Amara and Zuri's bus pulled up, the twins stepped out and immediately froze at the entrance. Amara's art portfolio slipped from her fingers, hitting the ground with a soft thud. Zuri reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it tight. "Come on," Zuri whispered, tugging gently. "Don't let them see us react." They walked through the gate with their heads held high, though their steps felt heavy. As they passed the gathered staff members, some offered weak smiles of support, while others suddenly found their phones fascinating. Inside, the school hallways buzzed with unusual energy. A group of students stood by their lockers wearing all black, a silent show of solidarity with the twins. Jenny Martinez, a junior they knew from debate club, gave them a small wave, her dark outfit making her support clear. But near the cafeteria, another scene played out. Sarah Williams, a senior whose father was on the school board, held a clipboard and collected signatures. "It's not fair," she announced loudly as the twins passed. Mr. Darnell was taken completely out of context. He's been teaching here longer than we've been alive. In first period English, their substitute teacher, Mrs. Hayes, barely looked in their direction while taking attendance. When Zuri raised her hand to answer a question about the assigned reading, Mrs. Hayes called on 3 other students before reluctantly acknowledging her. During passing period, they overheard Mr. Bennett, the physics teacher, talking to another staff member. "This cancel culture madness has gone too far," he said, his voice carrying down the hallway. "Pretty soon we won't be able to grade papers without being called racist." Principal Jacobs moved through the corridors like a silent storm. His face remained composed, but his eyes burned with contained fury as he observed everything: the whispered comments, the divided students, the teachers choosing sides with their silence or their words. Students parted before him like waves, sensing the intensity radiating from his usually calm demeanor. In his office between classes, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the district office. "Principal Jacobs speaking," he answered, his voice steady despite the morning's tension. "Mr. Jacobs, this is Superintendent Martinez," came the response. "The state board has reviewed the materials you submitted, the footage, the testimonies, and especially those chat logs. They're launching a full investigation into the school's hiring practices and disciplinary records." Jacobs sat straighter in his chair. "How far back?" 10 years minimum. They want to examine every complaint, every disciplinary action, every hiring decision. They're particularly interested in the racial demographics of students who received academic probation or suspensions. That evening, after the graffiti had been cleaned and the day's battles had quieted, Jacob sat in his home office facing his computer screen. 10 familiar faces looked back at him from the Zoom grid, former students who had graduated or left over the past decade. "Thank you all for joining tonight," he began, but before he could continue, one of the participants, Leah Washington, began to cry. "I'm sorry," she managed between sobs, her image shaking as she wiped her eyes. I never thought anyone would actually listen." The others waited patiently as she collected herself. "I was captain of the debate team," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "But every time I made a strong argument, Mr. Darnell called me aggressive. He said I was intimidating the other students. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I dropped out my senior year." Another alumna, Michelle Torres, spoke up. "They did the same thing to me in different ways, always commenting on my lunch, making jokes about my body type. 'You don't eat like other black girls, do you?' They acted like it was a compliment." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I developed an eating disorder that took years of therapy to overcome." One by one, they shared their stories. Tales of isolation, of being the only one in advanced classes, of teachers who would never call on them, of guidance counselors who steered them away from AP courses, of the constant grinding pressure to be perfect just to be seen as adequate. Jacobs listened, taking notes but mostly just bearing witness. When the last person finished speaking, he cleared his throat. "The state board is launching an investigation," he told them. "They want to examine everything, every incident, every pattern, every decision. Would any of you be willing to submit formal statements?" The screen was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus Johnson, now a successful attorney, spoke up. His voice carried the weight of a decade's worth of waiting. "We've waited 10 years to speak," he said, his words firm and clear. "We won't shut up now." The others nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Some were crying, others looked angry, but all of them looked ready to finally tell their stories, ready to be heard. "I'll speak," Leah said, her earlier tears replaced by steel in her voice. "Me too," Michelle added. One by one, they all volunteered, their voices growing stronger with each affirmation. The faces on the screen were no longer those of wounded children, but of adults ready to fight for those who came after them. Friday morning arrived with a heavy stillness in the air. The hallways of Jefferson High felt different, tenser, quieter, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Students moved between classes with unusual haste, their usual chatter subdued to whispers. During third period, Ms. Roberts, a veteran English teacher of 15 years, quietly packed her personal items into a cardboard box. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the framed photos from her desk, the collected coffee mugs from her shelf, the stack of worn paperback novels she kept for students who couldn't afford their own copies. On her desk, she left a single sheet of paper, the words written in sharp, angry strokes. "This is no longer a school. It's a witch hunt." By lunch period, word of her departure had spread through the faculty like wildfire. In the teacher's lounge, the usual casual conversation was replaced by tense silence, punctuated by occasional mutters of discontent. Mr. Thompson, who taught geometry, stabbed at his salad with unnecessary force. "First Darnell, now Roberts. Who's next on the chopping block?" "Keep your voice down," Mrs. Chen whispered, glancing nervously at the door. The room had divided itself without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. One group clustered near the windows, speaking in hushed, supportive tones about the investigation. The other group huddled by the coffee maker, their faces dark with barely concealed anger. 15 years, someone muttered. 15 years of service. And she leaves like this. Principal Jacobs noticed the divide as he walked past the lounge. His face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened slightly. He turned down the administrative wing, heading straight for Vice Principal Kane's office. Kane sat at his desk, apparently absorbed in paperwork. He didn't look up when Jacobs entered, maintaining a studied air of disinterest. "We need to talk, Elliot," Jacobs said, closing the door behind him. Kane continued writing for a moment before finally raising his head. "About Roberts?" She made her choice. "About your silence." Jacobs moved closer to the desk. "Throughout this entire situation, you've had nothing to say. No support, no concerns, no questions. Just silence." Kane leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "I prefer to stay out of political disputes." "Political?" Jacob's voice carried a dangerous edge. "My daughter's being humiliated in class is political?" "You know what I mean," Kane said, waving his hand dismissively. "This whole situation has become complicated." "Has it?" Jacobs pulled out his phone and placed it on Kane's desk. On the screen was a screenshot from the Real Teachers Room group chat. "Because it seems pretty straightforward to me, especially since your name appears in these chats multiple times." Kane's carefully maintained composure slipped for a moment. His eyes widened slightly before he caught himself. "Those are private conversations. Private conversations where teachers mock students' race, where they share racist memes, where they coordinate their special grading for certain students." Jacobs leaned forward. "How long have you known about this, Elliot?" Kane's finger tapped his desk nervously. "Those chats, and they're just letting off steam. You know how stressful teaching can be." "How long?" Kane's jaw worked for a moment. "A few years," he finally admitted. "But it wasn't my place to." "I want access to your email history," Jacobs cut him off. "All of it. Now." "Absolutely not." Kane stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back against the wall. "You can't just demand—" "As your superior and the principal of this school, yes, I can. Especially with an active investigation ongoing." "This is ridiculous." Kane's face had turned red. "You're destroying this school. Do you know what people are saying? The parents calling? The donors threatening to pull funding?" He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "I won't be part of this witch hunt. You want my emails? Talk to my lawyer." He stormed out of the office, leaving Jacob standing there, his expression grim. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, Amara and Zuri sat at their usual table. But something was different. The seats around them, normally filled with friends and acquaintances, remained conspicuously empty. Students who had worn black in solidarity just yesterday now avoided eye contact as they passed. "Jenny won't answer my texts," Zuri said quietly, pushing her food around her plate. "Neither will Marcus or Tiana." Amara watched as a group of students huddled around a phone, throwing furtive glances in their direction. "They're scared," she said. "Or their parents are." A snippet of conversation drifted over from a nearby table. "Firing all the white teachers. My mom says he's trying to push some kind of agenda, Heard Kane saying this is just the beginning. That evening, the emergency board meeting convened in the school library. The usual formality of these meetings had been stripped away by urgency. Board members sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, their faces tense under the fluorescent lights. Jacob stood before them, his posture straight but tired. "I'm requesting the immediate suspension of Vice Principal Elliot Kane, pending investigation into his role in covering up discriminatory practices." He presented his evidence methodically: Kane's presence in the group chats, his admission of prior knowledge, his pattern of dismissing or losing certain complaints over the years. Ms. Valencia, who had supported Jacobs from the beginning, spoke first. "This is deeply disturbing. The fact that an administrator knew about this behavior and did nothing." "We need to be careful," another board member interrupted. "We're already facing potential lawsuits from Mr. Darnell. Adding another suspension could..." "Could what?" Ms. Valencia challenged. "Show that we're serious about addressing systematic discrimination in our school?" The debate continued for 30 minutes before the chair called for a vote. The tension in the room was palpable as hands were raised. 4 in favor, 1 against. Kane, who had been sitting silently in the corner, stood up as soon as the vote was counted. Without a word, he walked out, letting the door slam behind him. Jacobs gathered his materials slowly, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. As he walked to his car in the darkened parking lot, something caught his eye. A white envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. He pulled it free and opened it under the dim parking lot lights. The message inside was typed, anonymous. "You think you're fixing things, but you're just burning them down." Jacobs stared at the note for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it in his briefcase. Evidence for another day. Another battle in what was becoming a long war. The Saturday morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the Jacobs family breakfast table. Empty plates with traces of syrup and toast crumbs sat pushed aside as Amara, Zuri, and their father huddled around a fresh pot of coffee. The weight of the past week hung heavy in the air, visible in the dark circles under their eyes and the slight slump in their shoulders. Amara suddenly straightened up, reaching for her backpack. She pulled out a spiral notebook, its cover decorated with her distinctive artwork. Intricate patterns framing the words, "Ideas for Change," in bold letters. "If they think we're trying to divide people," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "let's prove them wrong." She opened the notebook to a fresh page and laid it flat on the table between them. Zuri leaned forward, curiosity replacing the exhaustion in her eyes. Their father set down his coffee mug, giving Amara his full attention. "I've been thinking," Amara continued, uncapping a pen, "what if we created a mentorship program for students of color? Not just about dealing with discrimination, but about building community, sharing experiences, supporting each other." She began sketching out a rough diagram on the page. "We could have older students mentoring younger ones, maybe even bring in alumni who've gone through similar experiences, create a safe space for conversations that need to happen." Principal Jacobs nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly the kind of proactive approach we need." He pulled the notebook closer, studying Amara's initial outline. "We could call it Bridge because it's about connecting people, building understanding." His fingers drummed against the table as ideas began flowing. "We could offer paid stipends for mentors, make it a real commitment, not just volunteer work. And we should involve the community too, bring in successful professionals who can share their stories." Zuri, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What about training? If we're going to have student facilitators, they need to know how to handle difficult conversations." "Exactly," their father agreed. "We could develop a training track for student leaders, teach conflict resolution, cultural competency, how to create inclusive spaces." Amara was writing furiously now, capturing every suggestion. "And it needs to be open to everyone," she insisted. "Not just students of color. We need allies who want to learn and understand." The morning stretched into afternoon as they refined the concept. Jacobs made notes on his laptop, transforming their brainstorming into a formal proposal for the board. He emphasized the program's potential to heal divisions and create positive change, rather than focusing on punishment or blame. Meanwhile, Amara and Zuri moved to the living room floor, surrounded by art supplies and Zuri's laptop. Amara sketched design concepts for flyers while Zuri crafted the perfect wording, clear, inviting, and powerful without being confrontational. Bridge, building understanding, creating community, Zuri read aloud from her draft. Join us in creating meaningful connections and conversations across cultures. Be part of the change. Amara finished the design, 2 hands reaching across a divide, fingers almost touching, with multiple skin tones represented in the background. The image captured both the challenge and the hope inherent in their mission. They posted the flyer on their social media accounts that evening, sharing it across various student groups and clubs. The response was immediate. Within hours, students began sharing it widely, adding their own supportive comments. By Sunday evening, their inbox was flooded with signups. Over 60 students had expressed interest, including several white students who specifically mentioned wanting to be better allies. Some of the messages brought tears to their eyes. "I felt so alone dealing with this stuff. Thank you for creating this. Count me in. It's time we talked about these things openly. I want to learn how to do better, how to really understand." That evening, the Jacobs family gathered around the dinner table again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Hope had replaced exhaustion. Principal Jacobs raised his water glass in a toast. "To healing forward," he said, his voice full of pride as he looked at his daughters. "This is how real change happens, not just by fighting what's wrong, but by building something better." Amara and Zuri clinked their glasses against his, their faces glowing with purpose and possibility. For the first time in days, they felt like they were moving in the right direction. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Jacob sat at his desk reviewing the final draft of the bridge proposal. His email notification chimed. New message from an unfamiliar address. Anonymous 7392@burnermail.com. The subject line read simply, "Watch yourself." His cursor hovered over the delete button. He'd received plenty of hostile emails lately, but something made him open it. The message was brief. "Pull back the mentorship program, or we pull up your past." Below was an attached image. Jacobs clicked it open and felt his stomach drop. The photo was grainy but clear enough. A much younger version of himself, hands cuffed behind his back, being led away by police officers. 15 years ago. A past he thought he'd left behind. He stared at the image for a long moment, his hand gripping the edge of his desk. The timestamp in the corner read 2008, a reminder of a different life, a different man, a moment he'd worked so hard to move beyond. The harsh glow of the computer screen cast shadows across Elijah Jacobs' face as he sat alone in his home office that Sunday night. The photograph stared back at him from the monitor, a moment frozen in time from 15 years ago. His younger self, barely 19, with handcuffs glinting behind his back as 2 officers led him away from a protest that had turned chaotic. The memory of that night flooded back. He'd been attending a peaceful demonstration against police brutality when his friend Marcus was targeted by officers. Without thinking, Jacobs had stepped between them, trying to de-escalate. Instead, he found himself slammed against a patrol car, his wrists bound tight enough to leave marks. The charges had been dropped within days. The record was sealed. He'd gone on to finish college, earn his teaching credentials, and build a career in education. But here was that moment, threatening to undo everything he'd worked for. His phone buzzed, a text from his lawyer, Sandra Chen. "Call me ASAP." 20 minutes later, they were deep in consultation over video chat. Sandra's face was serious but determined as she laid out their options. "They're trying to shame you into silence," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But here's the thing. There's no actual dirt here. You were wrongfully arrested at a protest. The charges were dropped, and the record sealed. If anything, this story could work in your favor." Jacobs leaned back in his chair, considering. "You think I should get ahead of it?" "I think you should own it completely," Sandra replied. "Call their bluff. Turn their weapon into your shield." After hanging up, Jacobs spent hours drafting what he would say. By midnight, his desk was covered in crumpled paper, but he had his speech ready. He texted the superintendent requesting an all-school assembly for the next morning. Monday dawned clear and cold. The school auditorium filled quickly with curious students, nervous staff members, and several news crews who'd caught wind that something big was happening. Amara and Zuri sat in the front row, exchanging worried glances. Their father hadn't told them what this was about. Jacob stood at the podium, his red folder conspicuously absent. Instead, he held a single sheet of paper. Behind him, a projector screen remained dark. "Today," he began, his voice steady, "someone tried to shame me into silence by threatening to expose a part of my past. They sent me this." The screen lit up with the grainy photo. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Jacobs let the image sit there as he continued. "I was 19 years old. It was a protest against police brutality, peaceful until it wasn't. My friend Marcus was being roughly handled by officers. I stepped in, trying to calm things down. Instead, I found myself in handcuffs." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some teachers shifted uncomfortably. Others stared intently. In the back, Vice Principal Kane and a few others stood up and walked out. Jacobs continued, his voice growing stronger. "The charges were dropped because I'd done nothing wrong. The record was sealed. But that's not why I'm sharing this today. I'm sharing it because this moment, this attempt to shame me for standing up against injustice, is exactly what we're fighting against right now." Students leaned forward in their seats. A few were wiping tears. Jacobs stepped out from behind the podium, the photo still projected behind him. "They thought this image would scare me into stopping our progress, into canceling the bridge program, into backing down from confronting systemic racism in our school. But here's what they don't understand. This photo doesn't shame me. It reminds me why I became an educator in the first place." His eyes found his daughter's in the front row. "I became a teacher, then a principal, because I wanted to build a system where students don't have to fight these battles alone, where speaking up against injustice is celebrated, not punished, where our differences make us stronger, not divided." The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the camera crews had stopped shuffling around. "So yes, I was arrested at 19 for standing up for what's right. And yes, I'm standing up again today. The bridge program will continue. The investigations will proceed. And anyone who thinks they can use shame or fear to stop us from creating positive change in this school doesn't understand what real strength looks like." He gestured to the photo behind him. "This isn't my shame, this is my story, and I'm done letting others try to write the ending." As he stepped back from the microphone, the auditorium erupted in applause. Students stood, many crying openly. Several teachers who had remained walked forward to shake his hand. The media crews scrambled to get closer. Through the crowd, Amara and Zuri made their way to their father. They wrapped their arms around him in a tight embrace, their eyes glistening with tears and pride. "You didn't have to do that," Zuri whispered against his shoulder. Jacobs held his daughters close. "I did," he replied softly, "because they'll always try to shame us for surviving." When they finally pulled apart, Jacobs could see the reporters gathering outside the auditorium doors, microphones ready, cameras rolling. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and walked straight toward them. No hesitation, no fear, no shame. The questions came rapid fire. "Principal Jacobs, was this in response to a threat? Will this affect the ongoing investigation? What message are you sending to your students?" But Jacobs moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, offering no further comment. His statement had been made where it mattered most, in front of his students and staff. By that evening, his phone was flooded with messages of support. But one email stood out, from Tech Forward, a local Black-owned technology firm. The subject line read, "Supporting Bridge Program, $50,000 grant enclosed." The message was simple. "We believe in what you're building. Let us help make it stronger." The Monday morning sun cast long shadows across Ridgeview High's campus as three figures made their way up the main steps. They moved with purposeful strides, their briefcases swinging in rhythm, their expressions stern and focused. The state investigation team had arrived. Principal Elijah Jacobs stood at the entrance to greet them, his demeanor calm despite the growing crowd of protesters gathering at the school gates. Some held signs supporting him. "Stand with Jacobs" and "Justice at Ridgeview." Others brandished angry messages, "Stop the witch hunt" and "Bring back Darnell." "Thank you for coming," Jacobs said, extending his hand to the lead investigator, Dr. Martinez. "We have everything prepared in the conference room." Inside, away from the noise and chaos, Jacobs methodically laid out the evidence. The conference room table became a timeline of discrimination, each piece carefully labeled and annotated. Security footage played silently on the wall-mounted screen, showing incident after incident of Darnell's subtle but persistent harassment. "Here's the pattern," Jacobs explained, pointing to a series of dates. "The microaggressions escalated whenever students showed confidence or challenged his authority. It was systematic." Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes while her team reviewed the chat logs from the real teacher's room. The messages painted a disturbing picture of casual racism masquerading as professional concern. "And these complaints?" asked one investigator, holding up a thick folder, "all previously unreported?" "Buried," Jacobs corrected. "Not unreported, there's a difference." Through the windows, they could hear the crowd growing louder. News vans had arrived, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. The protest signs multiplied, colors and slogans blending together in a chaotic rainbow of anger and support. By midday, the investigation team had interviewed 15 students, 7 current teachers, and 4 alumni via video call. Each testimony added another layer to the story, building a picture that could no longer be ignored or explained away. The boardroom filled slowly that afternoon. Board members took their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others sitting straight-backed and determined. The vote loomed before them like a storm cloud. Vice Principal Kane's statement arrived by email, read aloud by his attorney. "Principal Jacobs has manipulated this situation through emotional theatrics and personal vendettas. His dramatic revelation about his arrest record was a calculated move to distract from his systematic targeting of veteran teachers. This is not justice. It's revenge." The words hung in the air for a moment before being swept away by the next presentation. The screen flickered to life, showing a young woman's face. Leah Washington sat in what appeared to be a home office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My name is Leah Washington," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I graduated from Ridgeview High 5 years ago. Or rather, I should say, I left Ridgeview High 5 years ago." The room grew still as Leah shared her story. She described the subtle ways Darnell had undermined her confidence, the jokes that weren't really jokes, the way he'd dismiss her ideas in debate class while praising similar points from white students. "It wasn't just the obvious things," she explained, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera. "It was the way he'd sigh when I raised my hand, the way he'd check my sources twice but accept others without question, the way he'd say articulate like it was surprising." Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but her voice remained clear. "I started having panic attacks before his class. I stopped eating. She paused, taking a deep breath. "I started thinking about ways to make it all stop. Permanent ways." The boardroom was absolutely silent. Even the protest noise outside seemed muted. "I dropped out instead," Leah continued. "Got my GED. Went to college elsewhere. But I carried that shame for years. Shame that wasn't mine to carry. And when I heard about what happened to Amara and Zuri, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Because silence is what he counted on. What they all counted on." After Leah's testimony ended, the board members sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Ms. Valencia was the first to speak. "I move to vote," she said firmly, "on all 3 measures: Mr. Darnell's termination, Principal Jacobs's reforms, and Vice Principal Kane's employment status." The vote was called. 5 hands raised in succession without hesitation. "The motion passes unanimously," the board chair announced. "Mr. Darnell's termination is upheld with cause. The Bridge Mentorship Program, equity training, and anti-bias evaluations will be implemented immediately, and Vice Principal Kane's employment is terminated effective immediately." Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. As Jacobs emerged from the building, reporters surged forward, microphones extended like weapons. "Principal Jacobs, do you have any regrets about how this situation has unfolded?" He paused, looking directly into the nearest camera. "My only regret," he said clearly, "is that it took this long to be heard." The investigation team emerged behind him, their briefcases now full of evidence that would spark changes far beyond Ridgeview High. Dr. Martinez gave Jacobs a firm nod as they passed. This was just the beginning of a much larger conversation. Through the crowd, Jacobs could see his daughters standing by their car, waiting. Their faces showed the strain of the past weeks, but also something else: hope. Real, tangible hope. The kind that comes not from wishes but from watching justice finally take shape. The reporters continued shouting questions, but Jacobs had said what needed to be said. He walked through the crowd with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the ordeal, heading toward his daughters and whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. The autumn breeze rustled through the newly planted cherry trees outside Ridgeview High, their branches still young and tender, much like the changes taking root within the school's walls. 6 weeks had passed since the board's decisive vote, and the hallways hummed with a different energy now. Where tension once crackled, possibility now flourished. Empty desks left by departing faculty members had been filled with eager new faces, each one carefully selected through a rigorous anti-bias screening process. In the teacher's lounge, animated discussions about cultural competency replaced the uncomfortable silences of before. The Bridge program's bulletin board dominated the main hallway, covered with more than 200 application forms and colorful testimonials from participants. Students who had once hugged the walls now walked with straight backs and raised chins. Their voices, once whispered, now rang clear in classroom discussions. During lunch period, Zuri sat in the library with Maya, a freshman who reminded her so much of herself from just months ago. Maya twisted her braids nervously as she confided about a teacher who kept mispronouncing her name. "It makes me feel like I don't belong here," Maya admitted softly. Zuri leaned forward, her eyes gentle but firm. "You belong exactly where you are. Let's practice how to address this professionally but firmly. Remember what we discussed about using I statements?" Down the hall in the art room, Amara stood before a circle of students, each positioned at an easel. Large mirrors reflected their faces back at them as they worked on self-portraits. This was the third session of Portraits of Power, and the walls already displayed stunning pieces from previous workshops. "Don't be afraid of those deep browns and rich blacks," Amara encouraged, moving between the easels. "Your skin holds stories. Paint them boldly." She stopped beside a student who was hesitating with his brush. "Remember, this isn't about what others see, it's about how you see yourself." The transformation extended beyond the campus. Word had spread about Ridgeview's reforms, drawing attention from educators and administrators across the state. Which was why, on this particular evening, the twins found themselves standing backstage at the State Board of Education's annual conference. The grand ballroom buzzed with hundreds of educators, administrators, and policymakers. Panels of experts had discussed equity initiatives all day, but the final speaking slot had been reserved for 2 unexpected voices. "And now," the moderator announced, "please welcome Zuri and Amara Jacobs, student activists and catalysts for change at Ridgeview High School." The twins walked onto the stage together, their steps synchronized as always. Zuri wore a blazer over a dress that featured traditional African prints, while Amara's artistic flair showed in her carefully coordinated ensemble. They looked older than their years, carrying themselves with the gravity of those who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Zuri reached the microphone first. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the room. "We didn't want to be symbols," she began, her words cutting through the expectant silence. "We just wanted to be students, to learn, to grow, to make mistakes without those mistakes being used to judge our entire race." She shared their story, not just the incidents with Mr. Darnell, but the years of small cuts that had preceded it. The way excellence was treated as surprising rather than expected. The constant pressure to represent their entire community in every action. Amara stepped forward next, her artist's eye taking in the sea of faces before her. "We are not exceptions," she declared, her voice carrying the same quiet strength as their father's. "You just finally listened, and that's the real lesson here. Not that we spoke up, but that it took so long for anyone to hear us." She described the Portraits of Power workshop, how students were finally seeing themselves reflected not just on canvas, but in the curriculum, in the faculty, in the very fabric of school life. "Change isn't just about removing the bad," she explained. "It's about creating space for the good to grow." The applause that followed their speech was deafening. Educators rose to their feet, many wiping tears from their eyes. The ovation continued for several minutes, washing over the stage in waves of validation and support. At the back of the ballroom, Elijah Jacobs stood quietly, watching his daughters shine. His face remained composed, but his eyes held a depth of emotion that went beyond simple pride. He saw in them the future he had always fought for, one where excellence wasn't exceptional but expected. After the formal proceedings, students from other schools crowded around the twins, sharing their own stories and asking for advice. Cameras flashed as they posed for photos, their smiles genuine despite their exhaustion. They had become more than students, they were now leaders in a movement they had never asked to join. A woman approached Jacobs as he observed from the periphery. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as she reached for his. "My daughter," she began, her voice catching. She faced the same things at her school, but no one stood up for her. No one fought back. You did what every parent wishes they could do. You changed the system from within. Jacobs clasped her hand gently, acknowledging her pain with a silent nod. He understood the weight of her words, the cost of silence, the price of speaking up. He was tired, bone-tired, but it was the exhaustion of necessary work, of battles that needed fighting. As the crowd began to thin, Jacob slipped out quietly, leaving his daughters to their moment of triumph. In the lobby, he passed a bulletin board cluttered with conference announcements and educational news. A fresh notice caught his eye. Principal Elijah Jacobs named State Equity Advisor of the Year. He paused, studying the announcement. A faint smile crossed his face, not of pride or satisfaction, but of quiet acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked out into the evening sun, its warm light painting the world in shades of possibility. If you enjoyed the story of Amara and Zuri, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't. If you enjoyed the story of Amara and Zuri, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.